want to start with, so the big news yesterday, Lending Club CEO, founder and CEO, forced to resign after, I won't go into the details because it's pretty geeky, but it was basically a financial transaction that gone awry, a sort of a somewhat shady financial transaction. And so he was forced to resign by the board. And we've had somewhat of a spate of these of late, certainly Zenefits being a very high profile one. We talked about the, certainly not a startup, but the Priceline CEO being forced out. And so I just wonder, what do you make of this? And maybe I'll just leave it really broad. And what do you think of this activity?
Yeah, and firstly, going back to the Fortune event, it was like it was a bit. I was expecting just a kind of network, and yet there was like Mark Mahaney from RBC, there was you, and I think because Spencer couldn't say anything, so it was like they were going to me and asking all these questions, and it was like I felt completely ambushed, and it was completely unpleasant. But I
apologize again. 5 years later.
But it was actually at the time that it was kind of remarkable that a company like Zillow, which I think the sort of revenue in the $50 million range was like. It was sort of unheard of that a company like that had gone public. OpenTable had done it a little bit before, but it was just
because they had to.
And there was all this kind of talk, like Facebook and everyone else, like we don't want to go public. It's a really bad idea. But that was almost the starting, the starting whistle for a whole bunch of companies that went public.
And interestingly, one of the very few in that sort of era that went public and has consistently added value every time.
Done super well, and we can come back to that. But I think it's. I mean, the sort of meta point is like how do you scale from being like a founder CEO to being like a public company CEO, and not get fired? What's the obvious things not to do is lie to the board. Have a relationship with an employer that you don't disclose, kind of like stuff which is have sex in the elevators, or encourage your employees to have sex in the elevators.
Encourage your salespeople to break the law.
Break the law, and those sort of things are like kind of the sort of easy things not to do. Take notes, anyone, if that's not. But I think the kind of harder stuff is like, this is for me, and I think for many founders, like this is by far the single biggest job that you've ever done, and you don't have a boss to tell you what to do. So how do you kind of manage this trajectory? And it's certainly for me, you're in this like big leadership position where you have a ton of stress and a ton of people looking out to you, looking to you to make the decisions and kind of show them the way, and yet you feel constantly, in many ways, like completely out of your depth. Like this is a very challenging position that you've done, very, very challenging job that you're doing, and so and you kind of don't want to admit that in front of kind of all your employees, and you also don't want to admit that in front of kind of all your board. And so I think the sort of way that kind of I came to terms with that, and the way that I kind of navigated that was probably a couple of things. So one, like before Trulia, I was an early employee at a rapidly growing startup, and that to me, and I was shadowing the CEO in many ways. So for me, it was just an incredible experience of actually like learning from someone else. Like rarely do you want to make mistakes on your own kind of dime, so to speak, or make mistakes when you're in charge, but watch other people kind of making mistakes. And that for me was incredibly valuable, and felt I could do things kind of having watched that. So that was kind of hugely beneficial. The other stuff for me is like incredible. As an entrepreneur, I don't like being told what to do. And I kind of like having, in some respects, kind of mentors to me were kind of quite distant because they'd done stuff that were perhaps like 10 years ago. But this stuff is so recent and so kind of fast growing that I felt that I'd learned more from my peers. That I could learn from kind of any kind of mentor. Because there's just a lot of, you speak to kind of mentors and there's a lot of like advice they'll give, but it's can often be very generic, quite frankly, and also very dated. and yet you're trying to figure out, okay, how do I navigate the App Store and how do I kind of do this stuff? And I made an effort to find kind of particular peers that were also in this lonely, insecure state of kind of being a startup CEO.
At the time, it was kind of lonely.
Yeah, lonely and
there weren't startups on every corner at the time. When did you start?
2005.
2005.
Certainly in 2008, there weren't that many.
Yeah.
But I just made an effort to find that sort of network and spend time with that. And so I used to do quarterly dinners with what became friends of peer companies that you'd share different tips and share different advice, and then you'd have that sense of like, okay, I'm not the only one in that environment who is in this challenging position, but you're also sharing learning experience, which I found super valuable.
So, was there ever a point that you, as CEO, that you thought that either you thought that maybe an outsider could run the company more effectively than you could, or that the board brought that up as a possibility? Was there ever tension around that, your position as CEO?
Not that I was aware of. There may have been like conversations behind my back, and I hope there were. Like the role of the board is fundamentally to kind of hire and fire the CEO, and so that's the primary responsibility of the board of directors. So I hope they kind of had that conversation, evaluating that. As a kind of founder CEO, there's sort of three rough stages of growth. One is the sort of 0 to 50 people, which is, the product development stage. And you're kind of like hiring and building, and you don't have much customers, don't have much revenue, and your investors will give you the benefit of the doubt. And then there's a sort of, and I'm generalizing in numbers, depends on the organization, but there's sort of 50 to 250. It's just a horrible period, because you're, as a CEO, you're the interim VP of engineering when your VP of engineering quits. You're the interim VP of sales. You're wearing all these different hats, and at a senior level, and you're kind of forced to context switch every single meeting, and that's where you feel that was a very challenging period to actually kind of be an expert in particular functions and change that very quickly. And I think we kind of, fortunate maybe for me, that was for Trulia, that was during 2008 financial crisis, and probably no one wanted to work in an online real estate company during the housing collapse. But then after that kind of 250 area, you end up hiring a management team, and maybe a little bit less for some companies, end up hiring a management team where actually you can just say, well, I'm not gonna, I'm never gonna be the best sales leader, but this guy is the best sales leader for this company. And you end up stepping away from kind of perhaps day-to-day management of these functions. But during that kind of like that sort of interim teenage years, it was frequently you feel kind of, and I'll be candid, if there's another person better than myself to run that company, yeah, then you'd kind of be open to that person. But I think one of the most important things just for not to believe your own BS in that environment, because you can have a lot of momentum, you can have a lot of success, but if you kind of don't have awareness of your weakness spots and challenges, then you can think you're this magical person.
You don't have awareness that employees are having sex in the stairwell.
Yes.
So you started in 2005. So when did you raise your first venture round?
So we raised our first venture round the fall of 2009. So we raised a Series A, which was a priced round. It was seed in today's kind of nomenclature, but that was about $2.5 million. And we raised 6.7 from Excel 3 months later. So
did you bootstrap from 2005 until then?
So, we started in 2005, and then we raised money pretty soon after.
Oh, so you raised the seed round, but then you didn't raise venture until?
3 months later. So we raised a $2.5 million Series A, which you could think of as a seed.
Sorry, that was when?
That was the summer of 2005.
Oh, 5, okay.
And then literally 3 months later, we raised from Excel.
And how did you choose Excel? What was that was 10 years ago, so I imagine that process was a little bit different then. How'd you choose Excel? How'd that marriage happen?
So kind of interestingly, so at the time I was at Stanford Business School, and I kind of, you're like, I'm at Stanford Business School, I'm really successful and important. So I have to speak to the best VCs there are in the in Silicon Valley. So we we find a way to kind of meet with Sequoia and Excel and kind of the other folks. And we had this sort of this kind of prototype at the time, and the way that Trulia worked, there's a back-end listing database, search engine, there's a front-end experience. So we went to them with this kind of big business plan, and we went to this with this technology that worked, although we hadn't put the front end on it. And it was, we just got rejections everywhere.
Mm-hmm.
So the big VCs just didn't think our product was any good and didn't understand the market. But Excel, interestingly, just kind of found my profile and emailed me and said, hey, you look like an interesting person we should know. Can we meet? More thinking, I think, to place me in one of their portfolio companies than fund me. So I pitched this idea. They turned it down, but we stayed in touch. And then 6 months later, we raised. But the aha for me was that during that process of raising money, we built the hard stuff, which was the technology back end, and then we slapped on a kind of a slick UI on the front end. And we went out to investors and said, we've got the technology working, we're kind of bright people, we understand the market, we understand the business model, and we got no's consistently from angel investors and from seed funds. It was only when we added the front end experience, the UI, UX, it was I get it. I'm with you. And I think if we'd done actually the reverse, which was let's just focus on building the UX and then do the technology later, I'm sure we would have half the dilution, double the money, and it would have been a hell of a lot easier in retrospect.
Yeah, but it's interesting because you were at that time, and that was sort of in the time where a lot of the VCs were saying we're done. We've already had our wave of internet innovation. Right. There was a pretty significant networking boom happening right then, but there wasn't a lot happening, certainly in consumer web. You were in the Facebook fund, I presume, at Excel, so you're part of the greatest performing fund in the history of venture. But that, I think John Doerr famously said right around then, there's no more money to be made in the internet, and he went off into clean tech. So you were reckoning with that whole sort of change in paradigm, right?
Yeah, I think there was, this was sort of when Web 2.0 was a thing. And it was sort of I think the sort of companies were coming out from the nuclear winter that was the sort of dot-com collapse. The sort of genesis of the idea really came from the kind of, I used to work in online travel in Europe, and then I just saw how information-based decisions get transformed by the internet. And so looking at real estate, it was clear this is an information-based decision, and that was transitioning to the internet, but there was no consumer product that you go to. And I came from the UK, and I landed in Silicon Valley and expected, people to be going around in segways and this high-tech environment, and so I'd ask people where to find somewhere to live.
Bring it back to John Doerr.
Yes. And so I was remarkable that the real estate was the only way to find information about real estate was to speak to a real estate agent and kind of become a lead. And so it was it felt just inevitable that consumers would be part of the equation, and bizarrely they weren't.
So when did the product start to work? When did the business start to work?
So we had the sort of model that we used was and it's a marketplace of listings and consumers, and we had this sort of real startup chicken and egg problem. If you don't have consumers, you don't have listings. You don't have listings, you don't have consumers. And we sort of hacked our way to growth. So hacked our way on the consumer side, aggressively focused on SEO, and hacked our way on the listings side by creating kind of a sort of hacking the listing feeds. So we asked the agents to provide listing feeds. They said, We don't know what listing feed is, and we essentially scrape with permission many of the sites. So do you mind if we scrape your service and scrape your site and put your listings up automatically? It kind of worked, but it was it's just incredibly slow moving. When it really kind of flipped a switch was actually sort of surprisingly after the financial collapse happened. So in 2009, two things happened. So one is consumers were like, there was massive anxiety about real estate. And you remember the sort of foreclosure crisis, and people were incredibly concerned. So there was
vague memories of it.
So it's, I mean, yeah, when you say vague, it's not, it's real, because like you live in the Bay Area, like people actually foreclosed on their houses. Like it seems such a distant memory away, given the prices. But it was, the consumers had this massive anxiety about real estate, so they had a thirst for information. They came to sites like ours. Secondly, real estate agents and brokers were in a, this was a fight for survival for many of them, because their volumes were down, prices were down, brokers were cutting costs, so they were retooling their businesses. And our proposition was, why don't you list for free, and if you want to buy some premium stuff, it'll be great, much like the Google model. And at that point, it was, the real estate brokers had been interested, but a little bit like, I don't know if you're friend or foe, kind of, how's this going to work out?
And at the time, brokers basically had no real online presence at the time, right?
They typically would have a website,
like a landing page,
which would be like caldwellbanker.com, but they're good at selling houses, not good at building websites. So the websites were universally terrible. Yeah. And so, but what happened was all the brokers pretty much in a 6-month period said, we're going to give you all the listings. And that was the sort of catalyst to basically give us almost national coverage pretty much overnight. So we had this sort of consumer audience that was growing. Then we had all the listings, and that just like this created this marketplace liquidity. So, running a real estate company in 2008 did genuinely feel like the worst job possible, with the double whammy of the housing collapse and financial collapse. But in retrospect, it built the business. It was that environment enabled us to scale rapidly. And then during that time, we also would we had some money in the bank. We were lucky with timing, and then we have so many months left until we run out of cash. We had to find a way to make money, and that kind of constraint forced our ability to figure out a business model which, given the size of the market and given how lean we were running, was actually quite successful.
And so your first year of substantial revenue was what, 08, 09? Meaning in the millions? Yeah,
I think we did about, I forget exactly, but of the order of 10 million around 2009, 2008, 2009.
And then you went public in 2012, right?
Public in 2012, yeah. That year about 67 million, previous year 38 million.
So what drove, I'm skipping forward, but what drove the decision to go public? Because even then, that was still a fairly small IPO, certainly by today's standards. Companies wouldn't dare test the market with that level of, with that top line.
Well, it was your article, basically. It was like, we're inspired.
Zillow did take off. The stock went up. Zillow went up 75% on the first day. So.
That guy Ari is saying something. Like, okay, listen to him.
Yeah, and then of course it was like, if your stock goes up by less than 20%, you failed. Right. If it goes up by more than 35%, then you've left too much money on the table. Yeah. So the story quickly shifted to, they mispriced the IPO. Yeah. Not that I wrote that. Sorry, go ahead.
So, literally, we had challenges raising money as a private company. We raised money in 2008, and then we couldn't get a significant step up in valuation to justify, and we were also cash flow positive or cash flow neutral. So, raising money in the private markets was challenging. And then we saw the Zillow success, and we felt that their balance sheet combined with the visibility they get from that would be, just had to go public to be able to catch up. And so, frankly, it was based off their
Yeah.
they tested the waters, and the market was big enough, and we had a differentiated proposition that enabled us to go out.
So what was the biggest headwind you faced to growth? I mean, the market was clearly big enough for two companies of that size to keep growing at a pretty healthy clip. What was the biggest concern
From investors?
Yeah, I mean, just in general, as a company.
So the way Trulia makes money is providing tools for consumers that access the information, and ultimately selling prospective buyers and sellers to real estate agents. And navigating those two sides was pretty challenging. We felt the consumer side, we could scale that pretty rapidly. Probably the selling to agents was the most challenging piece. And I think all these local businesses, the math around it is, how much can you acquire for customers, and how much revenue can you generate? So cost per acquisition versus LTV. And we're doing this in 32,000 zip codes across the US with hundreds of people in pretty unsophisticated customers. And that, and then there's high churn within the category. Real estate agents come in and out. That was we had this massive audience, but the monetization was the biggest concern.
So figuring out the return on your marketing investment.
To the real estate agents.
Right. And there really was there was no real incumbent per se, right? I mean, you were basically competing with the way that brokers did business through phone calls and mass.
Yeah, there were and there still are competitors, but it was more the I think people look at Trulia and Zillow and think, okay, you transformed the real estate industry. It's like, we kind of didn't. The real estate transactions are pretty much the way they are today. But we weren't disrupting real estate agents. We were disrupting the newspaper classified business. So we were absolutely billions of dollars that were spent in newspaper classified advertising in real estate, and that went to a tenth or 100th of the number. So that was where we were kind of focused on disrupting. So it's a pretty easy when you're when you're competing against the newspapers. It's you're going to win, they're going to lose, and someone else is going to win.
And so, why did you end up selling to Zillow? You don't have to. I guess all of that stuff has been published, but maybe you can answer it in the context of how difficult was it for you to effectively let go of the company that you started and built to a successful multi-billion-dollar business.
So we'd known the Zillow folks from pretty much at launch. And they kind of independently, I think, had come up with a similar idea to provide transparency and consumer empowerment to the real estate industry. They started with home values, we started with listings, but over the next 10 years, the products had kind of converged. Like what we had, they had, and what they had, we had, and kind of to a lot of consumers, it was kind of indistinguishable.
You were bigger in some markets, they were bigger in others.
So we had kind of more agent engagement and agent subscribers, which is true. They had a bigger brand than us. So there was this sort of dogfight going on, and I think what had evolved was that the category had shifted from being primarily a product-driven category, meaning the growth and innovation comes from product innovation, to being a category that was dominated by who can market the most and acquire consumers or acquire real estate agents. And there was, not to say the product didn't have a role, but it was like this arms race of who can spend the most money marketing, and kind of to what end. So that's not a very interesting game to play, to just whose TV ads are the best, and then B, we were the second, we were the slightly smaller company, and it was unclear with a large competitor with a bigger marketing budget how you would catch up. Mm-hmm. And so we courted over, the previous 5 years quite seriously. And there came to a point where it would be, I think the the numbers look good in terms of the valuation. I mean, multi-billion-dollar transaction. And then also I think there's a kind of sense of what we could do together is so much greater than what we could do apart.
Did it take you a while to come to those terms, though? That, like, it's what we can do together is great, but it's no longer my company.
Yeah, there's there's like, I remember the call from Rich. Is like, my first reaction was like, why on earth would I do that? Mm-hmm. And then you kind of like, you go through this sort of cycle of your head says, your heart says no, but your head says like, this is absolutely the right thing to do for kind of employees, for shareholders, for customers, etc. And I came out the end thinking, actually, this is going to be really, really good for many, many people. Partly because my DNA is a product person, so like I could see like what we might want to do in 2017, we could do then in 2016 or 2015. So we could just, and I get excited not about just selling stuff or marketing stuff, is actually just building stuff. And so you could bring these two companies together who were pretty confident, could execute well together, and we could start to do things much more transformative.
So I'm going to open the floor to questions in 1 second. I just want to ask, and so you can prepare those questions. When you look at today's market, how much does it resemble, how much could it potentially resemble the market that you were entering in 2008, 2009? And what's your advice to entrepreneurs who will have to navigate those waters? Hopefully they don't approach that level of severity, but...
So I guess the sort of, in the last 6 months, the startup environment has been less exuberant, frothy. So I think there's a sort of bunch of advice that I went through, and I think there's probably two big takeaways. It's like, one is like, how can you turn crisis into opportunity? And it's there's a bit of sort of revisionist, you'd want to avoid revisionist thinking around this about how, actually the financial collapse was great for us. It's not, it was a disaster, but it actually, that kind of persistence and optimistic thinking that things will get better, and using that, the challenging environment, whether that's to figure out your sales model or to build a team spirit or to hire great people. I think that was you can go into that in a sort of defeatist mode of like, okay, the world is falling, we'll give up. Or you can like, let's double down, let's crush our competitors when they're distracted and shutting down services. So that, it's a sort of Churchill quote, never let a good crisis go to waste, which I love. And the other piece, I think, while that's all well and good, if the culture and environment is not really well thought out and curated and managed and cared for, you can't navigate those challenging periods. So I think I can see a few former Trulia employees in the audience. It's like, it was a very special culture and a very special environment, and I think that that enabled us to navigate that. That's no accident. That was kind of well thought out in a sort of very genuine, authentic way, I think. But that enabled us to navigate all those challenging periods.
And did you, what was one thing you did in terms of belt tightening or cost cutting during that time, or did you have to?
What did we do?
Did you have any layoffs?
We didn't really, actually. We kind of, the nature of real estate sort of peaked in prices and volume in 2006, and then went down from there, and then sort of fell off a cliff. Mm-hmm. So we were in this environment where we were always running lean, and I sort of think of it like there's Nigerian marathon runners who are kind of running at altitude. And we had, we'd raised a third of what Zillow had raised, much less by that point. So we were like running frugal consistently, out of necessity and out of our DNA. Mm. And so we were incredibly lean during that period. And when things bounced back, we were in an extremely strong position. So there was no, there's not really many perks, and as a consequence,
you didn't have perks to cut?
we didn't have $100,000 statues in our foyer. I mean, there was no primary kind of like lens. It's a complex decision. I mean, there's a whole bunch of stuff from like, you know, will we get antitrust approval? How will the cultures match? You know, what's the kind of synergies? What's the pricing? There's no, you know, and you're a public company CEO running this, and like, you know, are you gonna like turn down a multi-billion-dollar acquisition offer? So there, I mean, there's a lot of different stuff. I think I get 2 points. One is I mean, M&A is really hard, particularly amongst tech companies. And I think and tech companies generally have this structure of kind of high fixed cost, low variable cost, because they're software companies. And so when you bring two almost identical organizations together, not only do you know how to run it, and Spencer's doing a fabulous job running the combined business. Secondly, you can create clear, actionable synergies, which are not some strategic kind of like PowerPoint thingy. They're like, okay, you can execute on it. So like bringing those companies together was like really important. The second piece is culture. If the cultures are not incompatible, and the companies are, you know, I'm former online travel, Zillow people are former online travel. We're like similar passions, similar vintage. It's like we both have kind of slightly unusual, funny names that don't mean anything about real estate. I mean, there's just a lot of similarity in the businesses, so we felt that the cultures, you could execute together on the business. I mean, the sort of, probably the like sleepless nights were in 2009, when you have a certain amount of money in the bank, and in 2009 it was like, I mean, we think things are kind of like, perhaps there's less money around. In 2009, it was like, the frigging world is coming to an end.
There was actually no money being invested in 2009.
No. Yeah, there was nothing. So you kind of, you know, there was what we had in the bank is what we had in the bank. And I kind of and we were losing money. I can't remember exactly how much, but probably $500,000 a month, that kind of order. And so, and we had like, okay, we calculate the kind of like number of months until we go bankrupt, because we just didn't think we could raise more money. And that, and I'm sure a lot of startups are kind of think that way as well. And that kind of necessity was the mother of invention, you know, as the old adage says. And so we ended up, and what happened was the original business model was selling to a small number of customers a large amount of advertising. So we go to Wells Fargo and say like, give us a $100,000 check. We go to these big guys, because we were a small company, we went to the big guys. That revenue just evaporated overnight. And so we ended up having to sell to individual real estate agents, you know, $100 a month, a product for them, which is a very different proposition. And we basically just scaled a customer service team, which was speaking to real estate agents on a daily basis, into in the space of 4 years, to a 400-person organization, which was directly dealing with customers, and then all the systems around that. I mean, if the company is ready, then, or you can get the company ready, then being public was a transformative event for us. So we went, you know, the year we went public, we did 67 million. In 2014, the year of the sale, we did 250 million. So 67 to 250 million in the space of like 3 years. Driven by mostly organic, there's some M&A in there as well. And so we scaled the business dramatically, 4x in just a couple of years. And there's no way you could do that as a private company. Secondly, we kind of built the sort of infrastructure and focus and execution to become world-class in a way that would be as a forcing function to do that. And we created liquidity for, you know, employees and shareholders. So I would absolutely you know, it's not all fun, and there's a bunch of challenges. But if you can, then I think you should go public as a business. And I, as a business person, I found it fascinating. You know, Wall Street to me was something I didn't know much about, but to go through that process was just an incredible learning experience. You're right. The salaries were kind of necessary, but certainly not generous. And stock, it was unclear how valuable it would be, to be honest. I would, you know, I think we really, you know, this is one of the, you know, I often speak to other founders, and like the unique privilege that founders have, and this is unique. This is like, I don't know how many founders, percent of the population, but call it like 1% of people are founders. They get to choose the people that they work with and the environment that they work in. That, like, do not take that lightly. Like, you get to choose the people you work with and the environment you work in. And so, kind of, I took that to heart and tried to make an environment which was super valuable and interesting and fun for employees. And I think that, you know, that carried us through, that people weren't motivated by money. You know, I counter that to Zynga, who was the sort of like, you know, my recollection of speaking to people, that Zynga was like, IPO, money-making event, IPO, money-making event, and that was the sort of like internal mantra. And that was never part of the equation. You know, trying to create an environment that people wanted to work in. And it sounds idealistic, but you know, we were paying reason. You know, there were clearly financial opportunities out there, but I think that focus on environment and culture was super important and super successful. Fires are bad, so like, and there is, you know, this is clearly a marathon, not a sprint. You know, there is what we instituted very early on, and I think many companies do this, but many companies don't, was extremely clear accountability and responsibility. Like, so like, you are responsible for doing that by this date, and success means X. And like, this is sort of, you know, a standard performance review in a traditional companies. And a lot of like startups are very sort of, oh, we're in the same room, we know what everyone's doing, why do I need to be explicit or clear about who's responsible for what? We're working on this team to change the world, and it's disaster. So like, creating like, you are responsible for doing X by this date, and you know, it's a conversation. It's not a sort of carrot or stick environment. It's like, what do we want to do? Who's going to do it? When are we going to do it by? And what does success look like? That clarity around execution is, and putting that at the beginning of the organization, I would say creates this, everyone has a forcing function that they need to do this by a certain date. And that drives efficiency, that drives execution. And that's just good performance management, but so many companies don't do it. I made many mistakes, like transitioning stuff, where you sort of say, well, you know, you're world-class VP of X. You know, you run the show now, I'm not going to get involved. And you know, because you know these people, they're like terrific at what they do. And that was a big mistake. And you had to sort of, you leave it with them, and then they kind of do what they did in the previous company that they worked at, and it's just not appropriate for the new company. So one was like very over detailed onboarding, which was like, and sort of 30-day plans, 100-day plans, like 6-day plans, just like almost to the guy looks at me after he gets the onboarding document, and like, he kind of thinks, oh my God, this is going to be a nightmare to work with this guy. And so like, be over explicit around kind of what sort of expectations are. And then I love this sort of, there's a Ben Horowitz a blog post, which was like, which I kind of saw in after the fact, but it kind of crystallized it. We're actually being very writing memos about what's important and kind of literally journaling it down and then sharing it with the product team. I found to be, I didn't do it quite as, I think, as well as the article proposes, but that kind of clarity of communication and sort of consistent communication around it, it was very valuable. And the third thing is just that to be on the bugs. Like there's always bugs, and so I would use the product incessantly. I would email engineers 24/7, spot things, correct things, and so they know that you're kind of you're here at the sort of vision and strategy, and then you're here at the bugs, because quality is the sort of death of consumer products. So you're just you're on it. That the little things matter, and that kind of makes sure that the team doesn't get lazy, and the team realizes that quality is critical. I started the business while I was at Stanford Business School. Co-founder was another classmate, Sammy. I ran into him yesterday. We're great friends, and we started the business. And I sort of conceived of the idea in the early days, and he'd been sort of thinking about real estate and kind of and joined up.
Is he a cyclist?
Yeah, he's a ridiculously talented triathlete, cyclist, and so we both had complementary skill sets, I guess, non-overlapping. I think we were good friends, but not like best friends, which I think was quite healthy. That we had a great environment. Probably the sort of single best piece of advice that I would give people in other situations was that one thing we did early on was try and have dinner together every single week. So we'd go out to the office, we'd go typically for sushi, and we would eat dinner together every single week. And that enabled us to create an environment where we gave feedback constantly, what you did here kind of really irritated me. I really think you did great there, and to create this environment of feedback from the beginning, so we could help each other to improve. But also created this sort of consistent environment outside the office where we could think about kind of bigger stuff. So and eating together is just such a great ritual, where you can have conversations. So I would. And we ended up not doing it every week because there's all travel and stuff, but probably every other week. So if I would, co-founders, if they're not having dinner or a meal together, less than once a month, then I think that's a huge missed opportunity. So probably two big kind of piece of advice. One is that in marketplaces there's this arc of evolution, and it's probably most visible in things like vacation rentals, where you've gone from newspaper classifieds where you used to advertise your cabin in Tahoe about 20 years ago, to Craigslist, to HomeAway, to Airbnb, and you've just seen this full arc of kind of offline to online to listings to transaction. And the same evolution is happening in the food market with restaurants. People going from kind of City Search, Yelp to Grubhub, Seamless. You've seen this. Getting closer to the transaction means you deliver a superior consumer experience, and you can also probably typically have a better business model that's more accountable. So one is just think about getting closer to the transaction. The second is typically great marketplaces find they're subscale, they need momentum, they hitch a ride on a fast-moving host. So the sort of, PayPal is a marketplace, hitched a ride on eBay. Zynga hitched a ride on Facebook. We hitched a ride on Google because we provided content to Google, and then people were searching on Google for real estate because they wanted a brand. There's companies now thinking about, okay, I want to hitch a ride on Facebook Messenger with my chatbot or kind of other platforms. So finding a way to rapidly partner with a rapidly growing platform or ecosystem enables you to achieve liquidity and scale much faster than the incumbent can figure out how to build, an iPhone app or something.
30 seconds. So you're basically a free agent right now. You're a board member at Zillow. You're doing some angel investments. Any chance you start another company, or what would it take for you to start another company?
No interest in starting another company right now.
Because you have 2 little kids, or?
I mean, more interested in helping other companies.
Yeah.
To be honest, it's like I kind of I just felt I learn more, and maybe I have 2 little kids and kind of want to go see them. Yeah.